Hello. Stone tool technologies are among the oldest, if not the oldest, of human technologies, so it's not surprising that archaeologists have devoted so much time to them. In this video, I'll briefly introduce some of the main aspects of chipped stone technology, including the selection of raw materials and stone reduction. In other videos, I will talk about making observations on stone artifacts, about use-wear analysis, and about groundstone tools.
Lithic technology depends on materials that break with conchoidal fracture. What that means is that when a hard object strikes it, it initiates a shock wave that travels through the material in a conical shape. The material is predisposed to break along the surface of this cone, which is called a Hertzian cone. Of all such materials, the one with the best flaking properties is glass. In nature, that includes obsidian, which is a volcanic glass. Also very useful for lithic production are various microcrystalline sedimentary rocks, variously known as chert, flint, chalcedony, jasper, and even agate. These vary a lot in their flaking qualities, but the most fine-grained ones come very close to glassy materials for their ability to propagate a Hertzian cone. Quartzite is a metamorphic rock whose flaking qualities are not as good as those of flint or chert. But quartzite can be good for making fairly heavy tools, like choppers and axes. Crystalline quartz is hard and can have a sharp edge, but tends to have very poor flaking quality. Consequently, it tends to be used mainly in regions that lack better raw materials for lithic production. Archaeologists tend to use the term basalt for various igneous rocks of the gabbro family. Although, like quartzite, they can be flaked, they tend to be used more for groundstone tools. Lithic technology is a reductive technology because it involves beginning with a nodule or slab of material and then removing material to result in something like a hand axe or even artifacts that are very small. For more than 50 years, archaeologists have learned a lot about lithic production by trying their hand at flint knapping themselves. A very good guide for this is this book by John Whitaker. And you can also find good demonstrations on YouTube. There are several different ways to reduce lithic material. Bipolar reduction involves smashing a nodule or a block on an anvil. It can be used to break open a nodule to begin the process of making a core, or to shatter a block into many small flakes. Hard hammer percussion involves striking the core or flake sharply with a round, hard stone, while soft hammer percussion involves striking it with a heavy piece of antler. Indirect percussion involves striking an antler punch that is placed carefully at the place where you want to remove a flake. Pressure flaking involves removing small or thin flakes by applying sharp pressure with an antler tine. Finally, some kinds of tools, notably axes, have their cutting edges sharpened by grinding. Important knapping tools are hammerstones. Rounded pebbles of coarse, igneous rocks tend to be good for this because they are less likely to shatter. Heavy pieces of antler can make good soft hammers, but they are vulnerable to damage and breakage. This one was broken during use by an unskilled flint knapper. Antler can also serve to make punches for indirect percussion, and antler tines also make good pressure flakers. A core is the block of material from which we remove flakes by percussion or pressure. The core can itself be shaped into a tool, as in the case of large bifaces like hand axes, or flakes removed from a core can be shaped into tools, as in the case of these sickle blade elements. Striking near the edge of a platform on a core removes a flake. Here you see the bulb of percussion on the flake and the negative bulb of percussion on the core. Breaking a river cobble can be a good basis for creating a single platform core. After removing many flakes, the angle between the platform and the sides of the core can become too obtuse. Breaking the core so as to remove the original platform can sometimes rejuvenate the core by creating a better platform angle. Cores can be really large, in fact too large to be held in the hand, or they can be pretty small, like this one that was discarded because it was too difficult to remove any further flakes from it. Cores can also be extremely tiny, like these single platform cores used to strike microblades or bladelets during the Epipaleolithic of the Middle East. Sometimes, knappers invested a great deal of time and effort to make prepared cores so that they could better predict the products that would be removed from them. The classic example of this is the Levallois core, which is carefully shaped much like a tortoise shell. When the knapper strikes the raised portion of the platform, the result is an elongated, or in some cases pointed flake that makes an excellent blank for tools. Here you see an example of a Levallois core. The knapper removed flakes from around the margins of the working face, and then removed a large flake from the middle of the face. Whenever you're flint knapping, you have to pay close attention to health and safety. So when you're flint knapping, always wear safety goggles, always wear some kind of protective gloves. Now some work gloves are pretty clunky and don't give you very much manual dexterity, so you'll want to try to find ones that fit your hand fairly snugly and still give you at least a little bit of control when you're flint knapping. And most flint knappers also have either a rawhide apron or a piece of leather or something they put on their lap, because you quite often want to steady your core against your thigh, because doing it freehand doesn't give you very much control. As you saw in other parts of this video, when I was holding a core freehand, I didn't get very much control over the flake removal. So steadying it against your thigh is a good idea, and in some cases you even want to put it flat against your thigh while you're removing a flake. Quite often also, this is a piece of flint here. It's a large flake of flint that I'm using as a core. Quite often, modern flint knappers will kind of rough up the edge a bit before they try to remove any flakes. And the reason for steadying against your thigh is if you're trying to remove flakes without breaking them, you can kind of hold it in place. However, it also means you risk hitting your hammerstone into your thigh. So I'm just going to steady it a bit like this. And see what we can do here. With a fairly large flake that just came off. Smaller one. You want to pay close attention to the platform angle. You want a somewhat acute angle in the place where you're going to strike off a flake. If it's close to 90 degrees, and certainly if it's larger than 90 degrees, you're not going to succeed in getting a decent flake removed. That's pretty good. That's a bit better. Anyway, so we're managing to remove some flakes from this. If I were a better flint knapper, I might have been able to get this to turn into kind of a laurelite biface or something like that, but I'm having trouble getting rid of this thick portion here. We're lucky enough to have access to obsidian. Obsidian is a glass, a volcanic glass, and it has very good knapping qualities. This one doesn't have a particularly good platform angle, but we'll see what we can do here. That flake just came off. Actually, a couple of flakes here. You can see that the obsidian flakes, when they come off, are very thin, extremely sharp. So one of the reasons why, particularly when you're using things like glass or obsidian as cores, you need to make sure you take close attention to health and safety. These are just extremely sharp. Like they are sharper than razors. And the obsidian shows really nicely the radiating ripples extending out from the bulb of percussion, because the Hertzian cone travels through the obsidian in really quite ideal fashion. Let's see here.
power off here. Didn't come off very well.
Next, I'm going to see if I can manage to make a small bifacial tool from a somewhat flattened cobble of flint. I start by removing some fairly large flakes from around the margins of the cobble. You need to turn it over from time to time to make sure you're taking approximately equal numbers of flakes from either side. The piece is finally starting to look a little bit like a biface. And I'll remove some small flakes around the margins to shape it a little bit more carefully. There's still some cortex near the middle, but I'm not able to remove it since my flakes weren't invasive enough. It's not a great result, but at least it looks a little bit like a biface. There are still plenty of imperfections, but I think I'll quit while I'm ahead. This little animation gives you some idea of what I was trying to do, although it only shows one side of the core. Using a soft hammer, like a heavy piece of antler, would also allow the flakes to be more invasive, which helps with thinning the biface. Flint knappers typically use pressure flaking to refine the shape of the tool around its margins, as well as to add features like notches. Retouch is also useful for intentionally dulling one edge of the tool, especially where you want to haft the tool later. Pressure flaking can also be useful for continuing the thinning process on our biface, as well as to finish its shape and later add notches. Adding a pair of symmetrically arranged notches near the base of the biface allows it to be hafted as an arrowhead or a spearhead. Although archaeologists tend mostly to find stone tools, it's important to keep in mind that these so-called tools were usually actually components in much more complex tools, in which the bulk of the tool was actually made of wood or bone or cane or some other material that does not survive in most cases. Recent ethnographic examples of hafted tools, like this axe from Papua New Guinea, demonstrate how elaborate these haftings could sometimes be.
That was only a very brief introduction to chipstone tool technology, and as you probably noticed, I'm not a very skilled flint knapper, so you can probably find lots of videos on YouTube that deal with flint knapping in much more detail than I could do, and also demonstrating work by some really good flint knappers. Although one comment I might make is that in some of those cases, you don't see very much attention to health and safety issues. So I would urge you, if you decide to try your hand at flint knapping yourself, to always wear safety goggles and work gloves of some kind. I know sometimes it really reduces your manual dexterity quite a bit, but it's really important to try to protect yourself from serious cuts and eye damage. If you'd like to learn more about stone tool technology, there's some introduction to that in chapter 11 of my book, The Archaeologist Laboratory, published by Springer. And there you'll also find a lot of citations to other books that go into flint knapping and stone tool technology in a lot more detail than I was able to do. Thank you, and stay safe.